All right, get ready, because today we're taking a deep dive into a world that might sound a little, well, let's be honest, a little boring at first glance, but stick with me.
Oh, it's anything but boring.
Right. We're talking about banking regulations, specifically something called covered transactions. These are the rules that govern how banks can interact financially with their quote-unquote affiliates.
Right. And they're all laid out in sections 23A and 23B of the Federal Reserve Act.
Now, those sections, they're basically like a safety net for the entire banking system, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. They prevent banks from making risky moves with their affiliates that could end up hurting everyone.
So it's kind of like having these carefully constructed firewalls in place.
Exactly. Firewalls that stop risky practices from spreading through the whole financial system.
I like that, firewalls. It's a good analogy. But before we get into the how, let's talk about the who. What exactly do we mean by affiliates in this context?
So an affiliate isn't just any company that a bank does business with.
Right, it's more than that.
It's a much closer relationship. We're talking about parent companies and their subsidiaries,
Okay.
companies with overlapping ownership, or even investment companies that the bank advises.
So it's like a family tree, but for corporations.
Exactly. And the key element that makes a company an affiliate is control. One company having significant influence over another.
So like if one company owns or controls at least 25% of another company's stock,
Right. Or has the power to choose most of its directors.
then that triggers those affiliate regulations.
Exactly.
Why 25%? Is that like a magic number?
Well, regulators believe that 25% ownership is enough to give a company the power to make decisions that could benefit itself at the expense of the bank.
And potentially put the whole system at risk.
Right.
I see. So we've got these affiliates, these relatives of the banks that regulators are keeping a close eye on. But what exactly are these risky transactions? The covered transactions, as they're called, that sections 23A and 23B are trying to control.
Well, imagine all the ways a bank interacts financially with other companies. Things like loans, buying and selling securities, issuing guarantees.
Right. The everyday business of banking.
Now, picture those same activities but with an affiliate.
A relative with a vested interest in the bank's success.
Or failure, even. That's where things can get a little tricky.
So it's like 23A and 23B are the referee blowing the whistle on any financial play that looks a little too cozy between a bank and its affiliates.
Exactly. These regulations set strict limits on how much business a bank can do with its affiliates.
Based on the bank's capital.
Right. So, for example, transactions with a single affiliate can't be more than 10% of the bank's capital.
10%, okay.
And for all affiliates combined, the limit is 20%.
So those are some pretty hard limits.
Mm.
But banks are pretty smart, right?
Oh, absolutely.
I'm sure they've tried to find ways around these rules.
Of course they did. They always do. But that's why the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act came along and added a provision specifically designed to prevent banks from evading these limits.
So it's like a constant game of chess between regulators and the banks.
They could say that.
Now, it's not a complete lockdown on doing business with affiliates. There are some exemptions.
Right. For example, transactions with certain bank subsidiaries are exempt.
Okay.
And so are transactions that involve U.S. government securities.
So there's some flexibility built in,
Yeah.
but I imagine there are safeguards in place to make sure those exemptions aren't abused.
Absolutely. One of the biggest safeguards is the prohibition on purchasing low-quality assets from affiliates.
Okay. Low quality assets. What exactly falls into that category?
It's basically an asset that's considered high risk. It might have been labeled as substandard or doubtful by regulators.
So basically a ticking time bomb.
Yeah, you could say that. It's like buying a used car that's known to have a lot of problems and hoping for the best.
Not a good idea.
Right.
So Section 23A sets those clear limits and safeguards. But what about Section 23B? What role does it play in all of this?
Well, if 23A is about setting the limits, 23D is about making sure the transactions themselves are conducted fairly.
Okay, so give me the rundown on some of those rules.
One of the big ones is that transactions with affiliates have to be on terms that are comparable to transactions with non-affiliates.
So no sweetheart deals just because you're related.
Exactly. It's all about making sure affiliates don't get preferential treatment.
Level playing field.
Right. And there are also rules around things like fiduciary purchases. For example, if a bank is acting as a trustee, it can't just buy assets from an affiliate without jumping through some hoops.
That makes sense. You don't want a bank playing favorites when it's managing someone else's money.
Right.
So it's all about transparency and accountability. No funny business.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've covered the basics of who's who and what's allowed and not allowed when it comes to banks interacting with their affiliates. But how does this actually play out in the real world?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. In the next part of our deep dive, we're going to explore the fascinating world of subsidiaries.
Okay, looking forward to that.
And we'll uncover how those firewalls we talked about actually work in practice.
Sounds like we're heading into even deeper waters. Can't wait to unpack this further in part 2.
Welcome back. So, we've laid the groundwork right. We understand how sections 23A and 23B work to prevent risky transactions between banks and their affiliates.
Right, those firewalls.
Exactly. But now let's zoom in on a really important piece of this puzzle: subsidiaries.
Subsidiaries, yeah. Those corporate offshoots that can make a bank's family tree look more like like a tangled jungle.
You're not wrong about that.
We touched on them a bit earlier.
Right.
But I think it's time to really get in there, and understand how they fit into all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Because subsidiaries add another whole layer of complexity to a bank's structure.
And another layer of risk.
Potentially, yes.
So it's not just about monitoring transactions between the bank and its affiliates.
Right.
We also have to understand what these subsidiaries are doing and how healthy they are.
Exactly. Because a subsidiary's success or lack of success directly impacts the parent bank.
It's all connected.
It is. It's like a chain reaction.
Now, didn't we talk about something called functionally regulated subsidiaries?
Yes, that's an important concept. And it was introduced by the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act.
Right, GLBA.
These are subsidiaries that engage in activities that are regulated by agencies other than banking regulators.
So like securities trading or insurance underwriting.
Exactly. So you've got different regulators overseeing different parts of the bank's operations.
Okay. But doesn't that create a risk that those different regulators might not be talking to each other?
That's a valid concern. And it highlights the need for really good communication and cooperation between different regulatory bodies.
I see. So instead of one all-powerful referee,
Yeah.
you've got all these different officials watching different parts of the field. Can you give me some examples of these functionally regulated subsidiaries?
Sure. So you've got things like bank service corporations, which provide operational support to the bank,
Okay.
mortgage banking subsidiaries, which handle loans,
Yep, right.
and securities firms, which deal in stocks and bonds.
It's a lot to keep track of. And I'm guessing there have been times when a subsidiary has gotten into trouble and dragged the parent bank down with it.
Yes, unfortunately, that has happened.
The 2008 financial crisis comes to mind.
Absolutely. Subprime mortgage lending by certain bank subsidiaries played a big role in that.
Right. So we have this whole network of subsidiaries, each with its own risks and its own set of regulations. It started to feel a bit like a giant Jenga puzzle.
And you don't want to pull the wrong block.
Exactly.
But that's where the concept of firewalls comes in.
Right. Those safety barriers we talked about.
Exactly. And they're not just abstract ideas, they're practical mechanisms for containing risk.
Okay, so how do they actually work?
Well, it's all about establishing clear boundaries between the bank and its subsidiaries, and even between different subsidiaries.
So we're not talking about literal walls here, right?
No. Sometimes it might feel like that, but it could mean having separate management teams, separate accounting systems.
Different office spaces even.
Exactly. It's all about preventing problems in one area from spreading to the rest of the organization.
So it's kind of like building separate compartments in a ship. If one compartment gets flooded, the others are still okay.
That's a good analogy.
So who's in charge of making sure these firewalls are in place and working properly?
Well, the FDIC plays a big role in examining subsidiaries and evaluating the safeguards that are in place.
Right, the FDIC.
But remember those functionally regulated subsidiaries we talked about? The Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act really emphasizes collaboration between regulators.
So different regulators might take the lead depending on what the subsidiary does.
Right. But if the FDIC suspects that a functionally regulated subsidiary poses a serious risk to the parent bank, they have the authority to step in and do their own examination.
So it's a safety valve.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about how these regulations work in theory. But in the next part of our deep dive, we're going to look at what happens when banks break the rules.
The enforcement side of things.
Exactly. We'll explore the world of examinations, enforcement actions, and the consequences for banks that step out of line. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the world of covered transactions and those all-important sections 23A and 23B.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We have, from defining affiliates and those tricky covered transactions,
Right.
to those crucial firewalls designed to keep risks contained.
Like compartments in a ship.
Exactly. But rules are only as good as their enforcement.
Absolutely. That's where the rubber meets the road.
So who are the people making sure banks are playing by the rules? Who are the enforcers in this financial game?
Well, you can think of it as a regulatory trifecta. You've
Yeah.
got the FDIC,
Okay.
the Office of the Controller of the Currency, or OCC,
Uh-huh.
and the Federal Reserve.
The Fed?
These agencies are the watchdogs. They have the authority to examine banks, investigate any suspicious activity, and take action if they find any violations.
So they're like financial detectives, making sure no one's cooking the books.
Exactly. And they have a pretty big toolkit at their disposal. They can issue warnings, demand corrective actions.
Okay.
They can impose fines.
Hefty fines.
Oh, yeah. And in really serious cases, they can even pursue criminal charges.
Criminal charges. Wow. What kind of offenses would we be talking about there?
Well, we're talking about deliberate, blatant violations of the law, things like fraud, intentional misrepresentation. It's not just about bending the rules. It's about intentionally breaking them to deceive people and put the whole system at risk.
Okay, so we're not just talking about like rounding up a few numbers on a balance sheet here.
No, this is serious stuff.
Okay, back to those less dramatic but still significant enforcement actions. Let's say a bank engages in a covered transaction that exceeds those limits we talked about in Section 23A. What happens then?
Well, the penalties can vary. It depends on how serious the violation was, the bank's past history, things like that. But they can be substantial. Millions or even billions of dollars in fines.
Wow, that'll get your attention. I bet those fines make bank executives think twice.
They're designed to.
But it's not just about paying a fine and moving on, is it? Are there other types of actions regulators can take?
Oh, absolutely. They might force a bank to restructure its operations.
Okay.
They might require them to sell off certain assets or even restrict their activities in certain areas.
So it's not just a financial slap on the wrist.
No, it's about addressing the problem and making sure it doesn't happen again.
Do these enforcement actions actually work? Do they change behavior?
That's the big question, isn't it? It's not just about punishing bad behavior. It's about creating a culture of compliance within banks. And that takes a combination of things: strong regulations, vigilant oversight, and a commitment to ethical conduct from the people at the top.
It's a lot to juggle. Making sure the rules are strong enough to deter bad behavior, but not so restrictive that they stifle innovation and growth.
Right. It's all about finding that balance.
This deep dive has been fascinating. We've gone from the nitty-gritty of covered transactions to the high-stakes world of enforcement actions. I have to say, I'm starting to see these regulations in a whole new light. They're not just about following the rules, they're about protecting all of us.
That's exactly right.
And it makes me appreciate the work of the people behind the scenes.
The regulators, the examiners.
Right. The people who are working hard to make sure our financial system is safe and sound.
They don't always get the attention they deserve.
But they're doing really important work. So the next time I hear about a bank getting hit with a big fine, I'm going to remember it's not just about some corporate drama. It's about protecting all of us.
Absolutely.
Well, on that note, I think we've come to the end of our deep dive into the world of covered transactions and sections 23A and 23B. I hope our listeners have learned something new.
I hope so too.
And remember, knowledge is power. The more you know about how the financial world works, the better equipped you are to make informed decisions.
Couldn't agree more.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.